Welcome back, everyone. Some big topics that I want to go into today. Also, do some breaking news. I want to talk, though, about an article that, of all places, well, maybe to be expected, New York Times had talking about the possible need for involuntary, meaning you don't want to do it necessarily, it's forced upon you, euthanasia. Typically, we would historically just call that democide or even genocide. The mass killing in this case of elderly people because they say there's overpopulation. And they cite a Japanese Yale professor talking about this, who it's a very bizarre story, and they kind of try to write it off as him not really meaning it, but then through the whole article they suggest that he did mean it, and then they even kind of talk about why we might need something like that. I think it's absolutely ridiculous, but this is where the discussion is going, and I think it's important to address this. I also want to go into the weaponization of government hearings now taking place and some of the stuff they're revealing. But first, though, folks, some updates with the rail crash. There's different news reports claiming, and I haven't seen the actual data on this yet, but I've been seeing reports all over the place, claiming that there have been traces of the chemical from the rail crash found in the Ohio River, and there's concerns of water contamination. It's not clear how much of an issue this is or what it means, but given what 10% of the country gets its water from the Ohio River, that could be a pretty big deal. I'll keep you all updated on this. I haven't seen any major warnings on it yet, other than just some posts. It's not clear how much the contamination is, or whether it's going to last. Keep in mind when you have water flowing very quickly, typically it's not going to be a lasting disaster. So I don't think it's going to impact things for too long. But it is of concern. At the same time as well, there have been some other rail crashes since, including in Texas, I believe Louisiana. I was looking at data on annual rail derailments, and they're actually pretty frequent, way more frequent than I actually thought. And so it might not necessarily be out of the norm, but again, given the fact that this is, of course, a big issue now, people are paying attention to it. Of course, we're going to focus more on the incidents that normally maybe we would not pay attention to. Regardless, I will keep you all updated on this as it develops. And again, keep in mind the big story here, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that the Biden administration overrode the rail unions on their strike for, things like paid sick leave, for the ability of rail workers to maybe get a bit of rest every now and then, because they were saying they were overworked and there were other problems. I've read different claims of what may have caused the crash, including basically forcing people to just ride through the crisis as it happened. Nothing too solid yet, but as information comes out, I will keep you updated. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into the first story. Let's talk about involuntary euthanasia. And I wouldn't even call it euthanasia at that point. I think euthanasia is a deceptive word that should just be murder. If you're killing people against their will, we don't call that euthanasia. We call that murder. And if you do it on a large scale, that would be genocide, or if it's by your own government, democide. That is what's being proposed right now in an article by the New York Times. The same publication, by the way, it's been promoting cannibalism lately. Those of you on YouTube, Rumble, Twitter, Facebook, we will jump over exclusively to Epic TV after about 25 minutes, just so you know. So be sure to join us there. I do an hour-and-a-half show. All right, folks, let's jump into it. This is New York Times, and it says here, a Yale professor suggested mass suicide for old people in Japan. What did he mean? Well, he probably meant what he said. And it's a very bizarre story, because they claim he did not mean what he said, then say that his followers support what he said, then say he actually says what he said quite often, and it's one of his main narratives, and then they argue for the virtues, or lack thereof. They argue for what he said. This is very mental gymnastics you find very common with New York Times, where they suggest something to start a national discussion, which we're engaging in, I guess, right now. But in a way that, frankly, I view this with absolute disgust. I think this is terrible, and I think they should be called out for it. But it says here, Yusuke Narita says he is mainly addressing a growing effort to revamp Japan's age-based hierarchies. It's a hierarchy, folks. It's the privileged and the underprivileged, but there it's about age. It says still he has pushed the country's hottest button. Further, it states, in interviews and public appearances, Yusuke Narita, an assistant professor of economics at Yale, this was a conservative, they'd be fired for this, I'll tell you right now, has taken on the question of how to deal with the burdens of Japan's rapidly aging society. And he said, quote, I feel like the only solution is pretty clear. He said during one online program in late 2021, quote, in the end, isn't it mass suicide and mass seppuku of the elderly? He says it's the one solution that's pretty clear. Maybe we can call it the final solution, in fact, for the elderly, as he's putting it, right? And it says here, seppuku is an act of ritual disembowelment, which was a code among the dishonored samurai in the 19th century. Last year, when asked by a school-age boy to elaborate on his mass seppuku theories, where he's promoting mass suicide for the elderly, he was asked to elaborate. It says Dr. Narita graphically described to a group of assembled students a scene from Midsummer, a 2019 horror film in which a Swedish cult sends one of its oldest members to commit suicide by jumping off a cliff. That movie's very disturbing, by the way, but I'm aware of that scene. It's basically this creepy pagan cult in Sweden. And when a person reaches a certain age, they force that person to kill themselves. And if they do not successfully kill themselves, they're then killed by the community. The professor cited that when he was asked to elaborate on what he was proposing. The idea that, for the good of society, maybe after a certain age, you should just die or be killed. It says further in, at other times, he has broached the topic of euthanasia. And he stated the possibility of making it mandatory in the future, right? He said in one interview, will come up in discussions. You hear that, folks? What do you call mandatory euthanasia? What do you call mandatory suicide? Is it suicide if it's mandatory? If someone kills themselves and they were forced to do it, do you call that suicide? If it's mass suicide and the government, for example, forces you to do it, do you still call that euthanasia? No, I would call that genocide. I would call that mass murder. And I would call that absolutely disgusting. But this professor repeatedly talks about this stuff. And it's disturbing that New York Times, it seems, really makes a really bizarre attempt to write off what he's talking about, even though the guy, when asked multiple times to elaborate on what he meant, keeps repeating the same basic thing. And it says here that he was mainly addressing a growing effort to push the most senior people out of leadership positions in business and politics to make room for younger generations. You hear that, folks? This is about power dynamics. Using forced suicide, forcing people to kill themselves, which, in Japan, the ritual disembowelment was oftentimes like, it wasn't always done for honor. Oftentimes it was like a criminal punishment where a person would be forced to kill themselves rather than be executed. That would be a punishment. There were cases of people doing it when, they were dishonored or whatever. There were cases of that, but it was also a type of execution. Where you do it to yourself. Keep in mind, Buddhism, in particular what they would practice in Japan as well, would forbid killing. And so rather than having someone else kill you, ritual suicide would be, kind of a replacement for that in some areas. But regardless, the concerning thing I have here, well, aside from everything else, one of the big concerning points I have with this is that this is, I think, part of the discussion on medically assisted death, like you have in Canada right now, like the euthanasia programs they're promoting in the United States right now, where you have this being advertised to people. You have it being pushed on people. You have people in phone calls. Right? We talked about this disabled veteran in Canada who wanted a wheelchair ramp installed in her home. And when she called to have it installed, because they have socialist medicine there, she was asked whether she would consider, medically assisted death rather than having a wheelchair ramp installed. Meaning, it's cheaper for society to kill you when you become viewed as a burden in the eyes of the collective. One of the problems with collectivism in general, if you were to ask me, and it's interesting as well because he mentions the movie Midsummer, which was very specifically about a collectivist cult, really practicing what could be seen as a very pure form of communism. The idea that pretty much everything is shared, everything is communal, everything is controlled by the mass, and the individual within the mass does not look at individual interest at all. You only serve the interest of the collective. That is it. Collectivism oftentimes overrides the interest of the individual. And as has been told to me before, and I would agree with it, the most important minority, the final minority, is the individual. There's only one of you, folks. There's only one of you, only one of me. That is the nature of individualism. And typically individualism, where rather than collectivism, you're asked to take care of yourself, to be responsible for yourself while still having a community, is the way that successful societies are formed. When you have collectivism, Benito Mussolini, for example, the founder of fascism, in fact, in his autobiography called My Autobiography, states that under his fascist system, the individual will no longer have the antisocial right to rebel against the interest of the collective. Fascism is collectivist, socialism is collectivist, Nazism is collectivist, and in all of these regimes, the good of the collective overrode the interest of the individual. And you see oftentimes mass killings for the good of the people, quote unquote. What this individual, this Dr. Narita, is talking about here is, according to New York Times, that he was mainly addressing a growing effort to push the most senior people out of leadership positions in business and politics. Now, does that sound familiar? The idea that one group of people holds an unequal share of the wealth of a nation. The idea that one group of people holds an unequal share of power in the nation. Business and politics would suggest both wealth and power. While the Nazis did that to the Jews, I'd say liberals in America right now are doing that to white people. In Pol Pot's Cambodia, under the Khmer Rouge, it was the intellectuals. Under Mao Zedong, it was the landlord class and the quote-unquote rightists. Under Lenin, it was the kulaks, the wealthy peasants who just had too much control over the wealth and too much control over the power, and they had to find ways to kill them under every one of those regimes, and I think you see it unfolding right now as well. This is what we're watching. This is the narrative he's pushing under a very different one, which is the hierarchy of age, which in some countries, Japan and Korea, you tend to have a very strong hierarchy of age. And he's saying this needs to be done, New York Times states, to make room for younger generations. You getting that? Maybe that's the final solution, the forced euthanasia. The forced euthanasia of the class that controls an unequal share of wealth and power. It states this, New York Times writes, "Nevertheless, with his comments on euthanasia and social security, he has pushed the hottest button in Japan. While he's virtually unknown, even in academic circles in the United States, his extreme positions have helped him gain hundreds of thousands of followers on social media in Japan among frustrated youths who believe their economic progress has been held back by a gerontocratic, generational, run system society." Further, it states Masato Fujisaki, a columnist, argued in Newsweek Japan that the professor's remarks, quote, should not be easily taken as a metaphor, because he notes Dr. Narita's fans, Mr. Fujisaki said, are people, quote, who think that old people should just die already and social welfare should be cut. And New York Times states, despite a culture of deference to older generations, ideas about culling them, that's a nice way of saying murdering them, you're culling the population. You're not mass murdering people, it's culling, according to New York Times. Ideas about culling them have surfaced in Japan before. It says a decade ago, Taro Aso, the finance minister at the time and now a power broker in the governing Liberal Democratic Party, suggested that old people should, quote, hurry up and die. Now, you should note that culturally this is very much against Japanese culture, like severely, where you respect your elders. Remember, a lot of these countries, Japan, South Korea, China, a lot of them were heavily influenced by Confucianism. And Confucianism has the idea of filial piety. Under the ideas of filial piety, there's respect to elders, there's harmony among people, there's, there is a hierarchy of age, but it also goes both ways, where there's a responsibility among older people to younger people. That social contract among, I'd say, the individuals has been broken to an extent. And just like we have here in the West, and we've had in other countries where culture is being destroyed, these traditions are being turned on their heads and are now being viewed as a type of kind of a roadblock to the progressive agenda, it seems. And New York Times states, further in, quote, shocking or not, some lawmakers say Dr. Narita's ideas are opening the door to much-needed political conversations, you getting that? About pension reform and changes to social welfare. And Shun Oto Kita, who's a 39-year-old member of the upper house of parliament in Nippon Isha no Kai, a right-leaning party, stated, quote, there is criticism that older people are receiving too much pension money and the young people are supporting all the old people, even those who are wealthy. And that's a problem, of course, of the population of Japan growing older and of younger people not having children, right? You have an aging population and the culture whereby, you would take care of your parents or grandparents is disappearing. It's now become a responsibility of the state rather than the responsibility of the family. And because I think it's become an issue of the state rather than of the family, and where you have a lot of people who never had kids in the first place, of course it is putting a weight on the system, and they're trying to find a way out, which in my opinion is a terrible, terrible way out, where they're talking about genocide. Now, again, this is very New York Times style, like narrative limbo. They're basically claiming this professor did not mean what he said. And then they're saying that he did say this and said it multiple times and then clarified what he said when asked about it, stating repeatedly that he was talking about mass suicide and even the possibility of forced suicide as a solution to the unequal distribution of, social welfare and so on. The idea that some people are a burden on society and some people just hold too much wealth and too much power. And then New York Times actually argues in favor pretty heavily of what he said, and then makes the whole article a discussion about trying to push for programs to enact what he calls for, basically. Even though they're not necessarily suggesting murdering people, they are talking about basically achieving what he wants through other means. Now, this is, of course, a big concern. We've talked about Canada and the MAIDS program, Medically Assistance in Death. We've talked about how they're expanding these programs, how people are being now encouraged to commit suicide, how it's viewed as a way to alleviate the pressure on the social welfare system and on their system there, where, of course, you have socialist medicine financed by the government. You have very long wait times, and even though it's free, it doesn't work very well. In fact, many people have pointed out that Canada's entire social welfare system and the socialist medicine system there would not work if it were not for the ability of many Canadians to travel to the United States for medical care, even though it costs more money here. Although if you're a non-citizen, you could just go into a hospital anyways and if you go to the emergency room, you get free health care anyways, and the Americans have to shoulder it because of the way it's set up. Daily Mail says something very important. America, not Canada. This is even though if you want to talk about continental Americas, Canada is technically of the North American continent, but when we say America, we usually mean the United States. But it says America is racing toward Canada's euthanasia free-for-all as 7 more states eye legalizing assisted suicide. Deadly doses are prescribed for anorexics, and more nurses are inking prescriptions. So if you have a daughter or if you have a mother who has maybe had an eating disorder, there are states in the U.S. now that will prescribe them drugs that will murder them. They can be killed now if they're suffering depression and they have an eating disorder. And it says here, Daily Mail reports, mother of 4, Alice Bozeman, wisely ignored her doctor when in 2009 he said terminal lung disease would kill her within 6 months, and then hinted that she used Washington State's recently passed, this is 2009, physician-assisted suicide law. Instead, back in 2009, Bozeman, who said was just too ornery to die, lived for nearly 12 more years and died at home in Colorado, aged 72, in February of 2021. There's a quote, I'm just so thankful we wouldn't have had 11 years and 10 months more of my mom. To see her grandkids get married and have kids, her daughter, Anita Cameron, told DailyMail.com. Now, Cameron, who suffers from multiple sclerosis, worries that America is racing towards Canada's euthanasia free-for-all, where people with as little as hearing loss can opt for state-sanctioned death. Her home state, New York, and 6 others are weighing whether to pass their own doctor-assisted suicide laws in the coming months. Meanwhile, some of the 10 states that already allow medical aid in dying, or MAID, are loosening their rules by cutting wait times, letting nurses join doctors in prescribing lethal drugs, and by letting out-of-staters, people who live in different states, visit to end their lives. And Cameron said, it's frightening, and notes that she campaigns with a group Not Dead Yet. She said, quote, we're going to see more cases of people using assisted dying because they're poor or disabled, and more pressure and coercion as it's all normalized into law. She said she and others look warily north to Canada, where the world's most permissive MAID system saw 10,000 people euthanized, killed in 2021, and where lawmakers could soon allow children and the mentally ill to get a doctor-sanctioned death. So if you have a kid or a grandkid, and your kid or grandkid is going through that very confusing time in their lives and they're teenagers, and maybe they're suffering from depression, and maybe they're at school and they can talk to their counselor, one of the quote-unquote remedies they could be offered now is death. They can be offered assisted suicide. And remember that in some parts of the United States, they no longer have to inform the parents. They no longer have to inform the parents of certain medical procedures being offered to children, including a gender change, even though they can't really change your gender, including, what should be just forced sterilization and so on. They no longer have to tell you of certain medical procedures, just showing you where that is rapidly heading. Now, aside from the possibility that, frankly, the state could actually mandate this, which is what's being proposed in Japan, let me go into that a bit. One of my big concerns is that if euthanasia is normalized, if medical assistance in dying is normalized and promoted even as just a normal medical procedure, first of all, other than it just being, you think you go to the doctor and get a Tylenol, why not go to the doctor and get, lethal drugs, right? Aside from the likelihood that we're already heading that way. Remember I showed you in a recent episode how in Canada they even made an activity book for children promoting the idea and even helping them internalize the, just normalization of the idea of people killing themselves. They had a whole book with, games and coloring and stuff like that on medical assistance in dying. Aside from the idea of it getting normalized, it's already being advertised and it's already being promoted, meaning that not only is it there as a last resort, not only is it there as something that if you're suffering and you're in extreme pain, and which is the way they would sell it at first, and they have tried to sell it at first. It's for people who are on their deathbeds, who are already dying. It's far past that already. It's people who have anorexia, people who have depression, people who just have a hard time getting by in life, even for children at this point, and people who are just any mental illness. And keep in mind, in the United States, how many people are on antidepressants now? It's a large part of the population. Everyone could be eligible now for medical assistance in dying. It's being pushed, it's being advertised, it's being normalized. Now, what just happened over the past few years, right? Mandatory medical procedure, very much like what's being promoted in Japan. The idea of mandatory medical procedure, and folks, if made medical assistance in death where you are killed, if that becomes normalized as just another medical procedure, and they reserve the right to force you to have a medical procedure, I don't think it's that far out right now to suggest that they may do that. And in fact, that very concern, that very idea that they might kill you, right? That they will force you to kill yourself or even do it for you, they murder you. That is what is being talked about in Japan as we speak, and New York Times is promoting it. Now, aside from that, there's also the issue you're going to have pretty much an economic state with this, where people may not want to commit suicide. It's not being forced on you. You're not being told you have to go to the doctor and kill yourself, but it's being done under duress. And you already see this in Canada, where people are saying it's too hard to get by financially. Cost of living is too high. They're being squeezed by debt. There's bad policies making their lives more difficult. They're stressed out. They're depressed. They don't see hope in the world, and they're getting this medical assistance in death, and they're killing themselves. I would not call that forced suicide. I would not call that where they're making you do it, but I would call that suicide under duress, where they're not making you do it, but they're locking you in a room and they're putting you in a very difficult situation. They're putting that gun on the table and saying, hey, there's a way out. Which, those of you who understand communist systems in the past, that was often something that was practiced, where the guards might beat a person or hurt a person or just do terrible things to a person, and then lock them in a room with a gun on a table, and it was just an understood message. That gun is for you to kill yourself. And that was a type of execution. And frankly, I think the way that this practice is heading is already very close to that. In fact, in Canada, you already have cases of people saying that they're getting this procedure for that reason. It's just too hard to get by. It's a terrible door to open. It's a horrible door to be opening, in my opinion. That said, folks, let's talk about the weaponization of government. The Weaponization of Government Committee just held its first hearing, and for me, actually, this is very encouraging to see, because what it's revealing is, well, first off, accountability, and it's making people who were with Twitter or Google or other websites or even just big tech or big financial firms, who were basically working as the gloves that big government was using to violate people's rights, are now being called out and being forced to testify. It's interesting now that you've witnessed some other changes as well. For example, Microsoft suddenly ending an agreement with an organization that was censoring conservatives and mainly creating lists for ad networks to deny services. You see now pressure. And in a free society, this is important. In a free society, one of the ways that corruption is kept out of the system, one of the ways that government is kept in check, right, is by pressure, by calling people out. This is why you have free speech. This is why you have the free press. Typically, the news outlets are supposed to be the watchdogs, the representatives of the American people, going out and calling people out. making sure that the system is functioning as it says it should, and making sure there is no under the table deals taking place or criminal wrongdoing taking place. And when it does happen, folks like myself, I think we're expected to go and find it and tell the public about it. That's what my job is, and I believe that's how the founding fathers intended it to be. This committee now is doing a very good job of that as well. Accountability, folks, accountability. And let's talk about the accountability now happening and what we're seeing with it. First, let's jump over to Epic TV for that. And folks, again, I do an hour-and-a-half show. We only do about 20, 30 minutes on YouTube. So come join us on Epoch TV. Before we jump over, though, let me show you a quick trailer. Yanya Kellick on American Thought Leaders had a very interesting interview with Aaron Siri on why are vaccine manufacturers the most protected companies in America. Important question to ask. Let me show this trailer, then we'll jump over.
When we finally had that data, you got a sense of why they didn't want the public to have it. Because it showed that 7.7% of the V-Safe users, of the a little bit over 10 million, reported needing medical care after a COVID-19 vaccine.
Aaron Siri, managing partner at Siri & Glimstead, has led several high-profile lawsuits against vaccine manufacturers and federal health agencies since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic.
If they prevail, in 5 to 10 years, what will happen is that we'll reset the normal health baseline in America for heart issues, cardiovascular issues. That will be the new normal.
In this comprehensive two-part interview, Aaron Siri breaks down how vaccine manufacturers secured unprecedented protections from liability 3 decades ago.
There is no other product that I'm aware of that is afforded this level of protection. And you learn things along the way that you just can't unlearn.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick.
Anyways, folks, a pretty important interview to watch, especially when you understand how this whole system works. That said, let's jump into what's happening now with the Committee on the Weaponization of the Government, revealing now and pulling back the curtain on how big tech, big government, and big money have all been working together to violate your rights. Now, let's jump into that, folks, but I'll see you on Epic TV for that. And folks, thank you for being here. It's your support that makes this show possible, so thank you so much.